let's get officially started. And I'm just going to give everyone an overview of JSET, and then we can take it from there. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's great to see a very diverse group of people in this community. This is our weekly seminar for the Just Social-Ecological Transitions in Latin America program. We kicked off this semester series a couple of weeks ago, but this is our first actual seminar where we're going to go deep into the topics. We were just, regaining some momentum in the last couple of weeks, just chatting, getting to know each other and building community. And now we have the opportunity to learn with and from our guest, Tom, that Joel is going to introduce in a second. But just for those who are new and those who might need a reminder about what JSET is all about, we are a relatively new program here at CSU, and our goal is to bring people together who work on a broad range of topics in the intersection of social ecological issues in Latin America, with a concern for justice and concern on how we do research. And we have been discussing a lot about transdisciplinary approaches and learning from people who are doing amazing work across the region from different spaces, whether that's academia or practitioners or the public sector and communities, community members, etc. So we gather here every week to feature some of that work and discuss around it. And our main goal is to build community and potentially have some collaborations emerge from this space, but also have a space for feedback and share our own work and thoughts. So wherever we are at in this process of embracing transdisciplinary research, everyone is welcome. And we hope that we will go beyond Warner and even beyond CSU to build that community. So thank you very much for being here. And without further ado, I will pass it on to Joel, who will introduce our guest for today.
So very excited to have Tom Perreault here with us today. For those who don't know, Dr. Perreault is a professor in the Department of Geography at Syracuse University, Del Plain Professor of Latin American Geography, and Laura J. and L. Douglas Meredith Professor of Teaching Excellence, among many other affiliations and distinctions. His research and teaching revolve around the relationship between people and their environments, with an emphasis on questions of social justice and political economy. In particular, his scholarship explores how rural peoples and their organizations access, manage, struggle over, and organize themselves in relation to nature and natural resources in the Central Andes and Western Amazon of South America. His extensive publication record includes co-edited volumes like the Routledge Handbook of Political Ecology, a path-breaking volume, and another with the Cambridge University Press titled Water Justice. He's also authored over 50 additional journal articles and chapters. And I want to also underscore that Dr. Perreault has a long-standing commitment to publishing in English and Spanish, as well as mentoring students from across Latin America. His work is not only principal to the field of political ecology and defining within that field of political ecology, but it also inspires critical transdisciplinary research on pressing human environment challenges. It's really always an honor to be in conversation with Dr. Perreault and to have him today. So thanks for your time. And you've been a personal inspiration to both Andrea and I in different ways. So we're grateful to be in conversation with you today. And thanks so much for sharing some of this new work that you have been doing recently. So we'll pass it over to you.
Okay. So first of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is that a yes? Okay. Okay, great. And thank you to, well, first of all, thank you so much, Andrea and Joel, for the invitation and the kind introduction and the opportunity to share this research. Thank you also to Paula for essentially saving my butt. I don't know what was going on with the shared screen, why I wasn't able to do that, but it looks like we're good now. I might have to tell you when to advance the slides. So let me actually. So maybe you could go so let me just give one sort of quick, very brief introduction to this this research. And I have to say, because of the way this talk the technical problems that we had, I'm a little bit discombobulated, so I sort of need to get my grounding. The other thing is, Joel or Andrea, if one of you would help me keep the time, and I want to make sure that I don't go over, because I always go over. I always will talk way too much. This is just a problem I always have. So I want to make sure that I try to keep it short. My presentation's too long, so I will try and cut it a little bit on the fly. So, Paula, if you could go ahead to the next slide.
Sure.
Great. I think, yeah, I don't think I have control over that. So I think maybe that's just you, right?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll just have to tell you. So let me just tell you a little bit about this new project. So I'm a political ecologist. I work in the Andes, and I've been working in Bolivia for over 20 years now. This is a new project. It's sort of a post-pandemic sabbatical, post-pandemic and post-department chair sabbatical project. So I got started on this last year, almost by accident, because the project that I was actually intending to do, well, a couple different projects kind of fell through for various reasons. And so I've been working on this project related to pastoralism on the Altiplano in Bolivia. And I'm doing this sort of in conjunction with some Chilean colleagues who are working on just the other side of the border. So I'll show you a map a little bit later. But one of the main areas that I'm working in is Sajama National Park, which is right up against the Chilean border. And Sajama is an interesting area for lots of reasons. But one of the things that I didn't expect when I started working there was to find a network of fences all over the national park. And having worked in various parts of Cochabamba and Oruro and other places in Bolivia for a long time, I was used to collective forms of land use, and had not seen a lot of sort of fenced pasture land that resemble, for all intents and purposes, it looks just like Wyoming or somewhere in the Intermountain West in the United States. So it looks a lot like parts of Western Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, places like that. So I was a little bit surprised by that. And so what I wanted to do is sort of work. Paola, could you go ahead to the next one? Thank you. And so this talk, what I want to do with this talk is look at processes of what I would call self-enclosure. So essentially asking the question, why is it that Aymara pastoralists, because I'm working in an indigenous area, ethnically Aymara, which had just recently, within the last 15 to 20, actually, yeah, within the last 10 to 15 years, had chosen to fence their commons land. And so there's this transition from commons property management to a much more individualized, I wouldn't say privatized, and I'll explain why later, but an individualized form of land management. And so part of my question is, why are they engaging in this form of self-enclosure? What does this have to do with forms of territorialization? And I'll talk about that. And indigenous identity formation or processes of indigeneity in this area. So Paula, could you go ahead?
Sure.
Thank you. So these are the three sort of conceptual main analytical concepts that I'm working with. Notions of territory, indigeneity, and enclosure. Okay, so next, please. And actually, you could just do the next one again. So I'm essentially asking these two questions. First, why have Aymara pastoralists enclosed their pasture? And the next one, and how have the practices of enclosure, how do these practices articulate with expressions of territory and indigeneity? So you could go ahead. Thank you. And the next one, yeah, and the next one. Okay, I have way too many transitions in here for somebody else to do this. I'm sorry about this. So what I want to look at then, first of all, in thinking about territory, this builds on a large body of work in the social sciences, in geography especially, but other social sciences on the territorial turn, which is now 20 or 25 years old. So this is not cutting edge work. but it is durable work. It's lasting importance in terms of the way that we think about territory analytically and politically, and then what kinds of work does this do? And so how is territory politicized? I'm thinking of territory as politicized contested space associated with and governed by more or less cohesive social groups. So we could think of national territory, tribal territory. We could think of other forms of territory. But this is how I'm thinking about it. So space, but space which is politicized and governed by a more or less cohesive social group in one way or another. And the next one, Paula. And one of the important processes, one of the things to think about this is territory is a process of territorialization. And so in this sense, it's an ongoing open-ended process. So I'm not thinking of territory as a fixed, closed thing that's unchanging. I'm thinking of territory in becoming. Okay, so next. Yeah, and so thinking specifically about indigenous territories, I think one of the fundamental factors of this is that indigenous territories are rooted in notions of collective control over land and water and other resources. Oftentimes in the Andes, indigenous conceptualizations of territory also involve subsurface resources, so things like minerals and oil and natural gas, and are not limited to the surface. This is a point of contestation between indigenous groups and the state. But we're talking about land which is collectivized and based on a shared lineage, history, or group membership. Okay, that's fairly basic. And in Latin America, there have been state and internationally led efforts to legally recognize indigenous territories, beginning primarily in the 1990s. Joel can speak to this history much more clearly than I can, but these are the recognition of indigenous territories, not to the idea that the notion of indigenous territories is new, but the state legalization and recognition of indigenous territories is relatively new and has a lot to do with the histories of indigenous organizing, not beginning in the 1990s, but the processes of legalization were primarily begun in the 1990s and have continued since then. So next, please. And so this is just a quote that sort of talks about the role of bounding and establishing boundaries of territories by Joe Bryan, who of course was Joel's advisor at Colorado. Boundaries do not define territories by delimiting them. They do so by drawing their elements together and organizing them spatially. Property rights can be demarcated and registered, but the overall purpose they serve is one of organizing society along familiar lines of power and economy. And so one of the important points that I think I want to make, and that I'm echoing Joe on in this sense, is that territories don't exist outside history, outside social relations. These particular territories that I'm talking about are ones that overlay and integrate within pre-existing or coexisting forms of territorialization and power relations that infuse these territories, right? And that the territories aren't outside of. And so how indigenous territories, indigenous conceptualizations of space then rub up against and integrate with, or not, state or other forms of territorialization is partly what this talk is about. So next, Paula. And you could do the next one as well. That's great, thank you. So, okay, so on to indigeneity. One of the things that I'm thinking about with indigeneity is the notion that as opposed to just subjectivity or identity itself, the notion of indigeneity is a self-conscious representation of indigeneity, of what it is to be indigenous, of indigenous identity. So in some ways, this is drawing on Bourdieu's notion of orthodoxy. He compares doxy and orthodoxy, the notion of self-conscious representations of what it is to be indigenous, right? And these are produced and reproduced and performed through discursive and material practices, right? That indigenous identity identities. Indigeneity is something which is political in nature, but it's also performative in nature and is reproduced through these various forms of performativity. Not that by saying that they're performed does not mean that they're made up, right? I would argue that they're socially constructed, but they're socially constructed through historically grounded social relations and always in association with colonialism. There's no indigeneity outside of colonialism. Indigeneity is an inherently relational identity, inherently relational category, and doesn't exist without the colonial. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that what we call indigenous people don't exist. There were Arapaho and Kiowa and Cheyenne in Colorado long before Europeans got there. But the indigenous as a category, identity category, is only exists within the context of colonialism, right? So next, please. So the question for me then is not one of who is or who is not indigenous, but rather how do we understand a thoroughly plural indigenous project? So what it means to be indigenous is not always and everywhere and at all times the same, right? There are multiple ways of being indigenous, and indigeneity in places like Bolivia, have shifted their focus in ways that are inherently plural and pluralistic in the political claims that they make. And so partly what I'm looking at is not a transcendental, ahistorical notion of indigenous Aymara identity. Rather, what I'm trying to get at is how is it that understandings of indigeneity, understandings of what it means to be Aymara today are produced in conjunction with, on the one hand, ideas of territory, and on the other hand, and related to territory, the becomings of the state, right? The sort of political relations within which indigeneity is formed. Okay, we can leave it at that. We can have some discussion on that a little bit later. So the next step that I want to talk about is enclosure, and enclosure is of the commons has long been considered a precondition of capitalism. And so the agrarian question is always an important aspect, an important part of these questions. One that I won't really get into today, but one that I think is worth considering in relation to enclosing the commons, the pastoral commons on the Altiplano. And this is typically seen as, enclosure is typically seen as something which is done by powerful groups imposed on less powerful groups, and therefore leading to the dispossession of commons, right? The next slide, please. But one of the things that is different about this is that the processes that I'm looking at are self-enclosure. There are choices that people are making to enclose their lands, which actually run counter to the rules both of the national park and of the territories within which they live, but have very specific reasons in terms of pursuing livelihoods and whatnot. So here's another quote that I think is useful for thinking about these things. Barbed wire, which is the fencing material of choice there, creates two polarized spaces, a threatening exterior and a protective interior. Since it protects, it reassures the people occupying the interior. Enclosing is therefore a political act because it marks out boundaries of private property, assists in effective management of land, and makes a social distinction concrete. Next, please. So part of what I'm trying to get at is how is this rather banal form of enclosure, the act of putting up fences to demarcate grazing parcels, what's the political work that's done by this simple banal act? How do we understand this process, the politics of this process of self-enclosure and territorialization more broadly, and how does this influence the politics of indigeneity in Bolivia? So let's just kind of power through these next slides. I'm going to skip this section in which I sort of take a broadside at Tanya Lee. We can talk about that in the Q&A if people want to, but just keep going. And we're going to skip through several slides. Thank you, Paula.
Sure.
Keep going. Keep going. Okay, here we go. All right. So let me just we'll skip through my personal beef with Tanya Lee. Actually, Tanya Lee is a lovely person. There's one paper that she wrote that I don't like, so we can talk about that later. But what I do want to talk about now is the empirical case. So we can go. Let's go to the next slide. And this is where I am. So I'm on the Altiplano, on the far western Altiplano, right up against the, and you can go to the next one too, right up against the Chilean border. And you could go to the next slide. There we go. This work draws on 4 months of specific field-based research in Bolivia, in working in these areas. Typical political ecology methods of household surveys, semi-structured interviews, participant observation, document analysis. So no surprises there. Paula, you can go to the next one, please. One of the things to keep in mind is that this area, it's all over 4,000 meters. The communities where I'm working are around 4,200 meters elevation. And so these are really too high for agriculture, which means that these communities are primarily dependent on raising llamas and alpacas for their livelihoods. Now, they engage in rotational migration, wage work, a lot of other things, just like most rural peoples all over the world. So they're not subsistence farmers, are fully engaged in the market, selling. And you can go to the next two. Let's go on to the next one too, this one too. Raising alpacas and llamas. And I included this slide in part because I gave a related talk at Cornell last year. And my wife happened to be there, mostly not because she was interested, but mostly because she was giving me a ride. And so she obviously didn't have anything better to do. So she ended up sitting in on my talk. And she was sitting in the back and she overheard two people say, I'm still trying to figure out which one is the alpaca and which one is the llama. So here they are. The llamas are the cute fuzzy ones, and the alpacas are the even cuter, even fuzzier ones. Alpacas are smaller and they're raised mostly for wool. Because their wool is soft and it's very valuable. They're also eaten and they're raised for meat as well. Llamas, their wool is really coarse, and they were formerly pack animals, but now they're primarily raised for meat, leather, and hides. Their wool is used as well, but it's not as valuable and there's not as much of a market for it. So we can go to the next one. And let's go on to the next one as well. I have this slide in here, and you could go to the next one. Let's see if this actually works. Yeah, there we go. So I have this little video, and this shows the bofedal, which is a peat-forming wetland that's crucial habitat for alpacas. So an important part of my research that I'm not looking at today, or that I'm not going to discuss today, are the bofedales themselves, which are threatened by climate change because they're high altitude wetlands and they're very vulnerable to drying out. And because alpacas are absolutely dependent on bofedales, this presents a particular threat to a real risk for pastoral communities in the Andes. Let's go on to the next one, please. Okay, so there's herders engage in a number of management practices, including irrigation, rotation of livestock, application of manure, selective burning, and replanting vegetation hummocks. By far the most important one of these is irrigation. So access to water, access to the labor involved in irrigation is really crucial for herding practices. But again, I'm not going to talk about that as much right now. Paula, let's go to the next. Let's do this. Let's skip through this one and let's skip the next one. And here we go. So let's talk a little bit about self-enclosure. The bofedales are really important for the purposes of this talk because that's the most important resource, the most important land resource that's being enclosed. So when I'm talking about enclosure, what I mean is the process by which families adopted fencing, put up fencing. In this case, you have chain link fence, but that's actually pretty rare. This is more expensive. It's more labor intensive to put up. And so most people use barbed wire fencing. Probably 90% of the fences that are out there are barbed wire. People would like to have the chain link because they're sturdier. They go all the way to the ground, which means that they can exclude guanacos, they can exclude pumas and foxes, and those are real risks for people. But most people use barbed wire. But this really dates only to the 1990s, and in most communities in the areas where I'm working, it really dates to the 2000s. So this is a relatively new practice, considering that camelid pastoralism dates back thousands, literally thousands of years in the Andes. And so it's a fairly dramatic change in land use and herd management for people to make the switch from commons property management to what's essentially individualized. And again, I'm not using the term privatized. Let's go on to the next one, Paula. Thank you. And so, but there are some real benefits to this for people, for their livelihoods. One is that it allows herders to leave their animals unsupervised, right? You have a decrease in labor availability for a variety of reasons, in part because you have increased migration outside the community. Some of that is permanent, and some of that is rotational, meaning people will come back to the community, but there's a lot of people who are just simply not in the communities at any given time. So there's kind of chronic labor shortages. And so this allows people to pursue other activities and to address those labor shortages without having to worry about caring for the animals on a day-to-day basis, without constantly having to be present to their base. There are potential ecological costs in this that we can talk about in the Q&A if people are interested. So let's go to two more. Paula, let's go two more. So let's talk very briefly about territorialization. And we can go to the next one. One of the key kind of basic forms, and I'm thinking about sort of granular at the scale of the household form of territorialization, is this notion of sayanya. Sayanya is essentially a reference to grazing parcels. So these are grazing parcels, which typically, those are in the this brown here. So each of these brown that looks like long lots, you see the blue. This is the bofedal, it's the wetland, and then grazing, the green is grazing pasture. The yellow is sort of more, is rougher, either bare soil or rock, or in some cases ice, the farther up you get. And so the green and the blue really represent the good quality grazing land. And the sayanyas, typically, the way that these are laid out, typically involve some of the bofedal, and then extend up like long lots away from the bofedal and up in elevation through these other ecosystems, through the grasslands and scrublands that are there. And with the bofedal being by far the best quality forage and absolutely necessary for alpacas. People have had sayanyas for ages. People always talk to me and say that this is, these are from the age of the tataabuelos, right? So the time of the grandfather. So people have always had sayanyas, but sayanyas typically had been essentially a recognition of usufruct, right? That the idea that people had an access right to grazing, and not necessarily territorialized in the sense that you could demarcate the space of the sayanya as a distinct grazing parcel. This is something relatively new, and which was sort of hardened in space with the advent or the use of fences. So let's go on to the next one. So again, sahamas are family-based grazing parcels, and the families within a particular community, the families, these sayanyas combine to form ayllus. Now, ayllus are forms of socio-territorial organization that are common in the central Andes, particularly in southern Peru and in portions of western Bolivia and the highlands, that are with roots in the pre-Inca period in this area, and certainly in the pre-Hispanic period. But that's not to say that the ayllus that exist today are the direct descendants of ayllus that existed before the Incas arrived. Quite the contrary. The ayllus are collective forms of landholding that are lineage-based forms of social organization that are territorialized within particular areas, and over time, in relation to partly in response to and as a result of indigenous organizing, partly in relation to state policies. You have the establishment of mappable territorialized ayllus within these areas. This larger map that you're seeing is a map of the whole municipio or municipal area, which is sort of like a county in the United States. The red outline is the national park. So that is consistent with the map that I just showed you. And you can see these different, don't worry about the different colors, but just know that these are relate to different, or these represent different ayllus within this municipality, and the municipality is also a marca, which is another form of indigenous organizing. We can go to the next one, Paula.
Tom,
Yeah.
do I have about 8 to 10 minutes?
Okay, I'll move forward. So let me just go super quickly. The ayllus are multiple sayañas make up ayllus, multiple ayllus make up what are called marcas, and marcas make up the sulyu. So the sulyu these are forms of socio-territorial organization that date back to the Inca period, and that again have taken on political meaning and are now consistent with political administrative entities like municipios or provincias. And ultimately, you can go to the next, let's do the next two. Thank you. These are consistent with, these comprise the indigenous organization, the CONAMAC, which is the Highland Indigenous Organization. And let's go to the next one, and then we're going to scoot forward. Okay, and this is really important, the tierras comunitarias de origen. This is a classic form of neoliberal, what Charles Hale would call neoliberal multiculturalism in Bolivia. So these were actually forms of indigenous and campesino territory, which were established in the 1990s during the agrarian reform of 1996 under the neoliberal government of Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, who eventually was kicked out of the country for efforts to privatize natural gas or to sell Bolivian natural gas to markets in the United States. And so he had a very kind of notorious downfall. But one of the things that he did, it was establish this entity of the TCO, which is a form of collective landholding that also requires a certain maintenance of traditional forms known as usos y costumbres, which are legally recognized traditional practices for land management. And these become requirements of maintaining the TCO as collective land. And so there's this kind of establishment of practices that are legally recognized that people engage in. So Paula, let's go ahead and just keep going, and I'll tell you when to, let's keep going, go ahead, next one. And what I would say is there's plenty to criticize about TCOs, right? And there's been a lot of critical literature on them, especially given that their relationship to neoliberal multiculturalism. But one of the things that I would argue is that TCOs, like ayllus, provide a territorial framework that for the expression, the performance and the expression of indigenous culture and a certain form of indigenous political autonomy. You can go to the next one. And so even in spite of its association with multicultural neoliberalism, TCOs and ayllus provide this territorial basis for political and cultural autonomy, as well as a material and ecological basis for pursuing livelihoods. You can go to the next one. And so one of the things that, and do the next two, please. That's great. So there is the tension between the individualization of grazing lands of the sayañas, because all lands, according to usos y costumbres, according to their estatutos or their statutes, the way that they're set up, TCOs are all commons land. They should be all collective land. And so the idea that land is being individualized through this sort of process of self-enclosure runs counter to the spirit and actually the rules that are used to establish TCOs, and against this sort of notion of collective management of land, which is the bedrock of the notion of usos y costumbres, so these customary practices that are necessary for maintaining TCOs. But it also is really important for livelihoods, for maintaining livelihoods. So let's go ahead to the next one and the next one as well. So what I would say is, and you could do, let's see, the next two, please. Yeah, go ahead and do that. That fencing, the benefits of fencing is that they allow pastoralists to leave animals unattended for longer periods of time and reduce the demand for labor, which is a chronic problem in the communities, because in a lot of senses, people are moving around so much that there isn't a lot of labor available. And this allows families to send their children to school without worrying about the loss of family labor as well. And it allows herders to engage in temporary migration or to pursue other activities within the community, such as commerce or tourism. So go ahead to the next, and let's do the next. Yeah, the next two, this one too. Yep, there you go. And so, but on the downside, fencing may be seen as unsustainable because of the potential for environmental degradation. And we can talk about that, but there are some real risks with overgrazing associated with the establishment of fences. But it should also be seen as a livelihood practice, as a key livelihood practice that, like temporary outmigration, increases the resilience of the communities in the face of ecological and economic uncertainty. With climate change and various economic forces that are making it more and more difficult for people to make a living, fencing actually is a fairly rational choice. It's a good choice for people to make, even in spite of the risks of environmental behavior. So not to sound too much like a logical positivist or rationalist, but there are, rat choice person, but there are some logical reasons, very logical reasons in terms of livelihood practices that people choose for this. And so the reality is that ecological sustainability, the management of bofedales, may not be the most important thing that people are thinking of when they're choosing how to manage the lands that they have. So let's go to the next one. And so this is the last substantive slide that I have, which is that IUs, marcas, and TCOs, these different forms of socio-territorial organization, these nesting forms of territorial organization, provide a social and territorial basis for social and cultural reproduction and play a role in self-consciously performative constructions of indigenous identity. And so enclosures, self-enclosure plays a role within that as well, in that I see this as another form of territorialization that's kind of nesting within these other kinds of things. And so the idea is that this doesn't make people less or more indigenous. It's another form of being indigenous, sort of in the way drawing on the work of Robert Albro. So let's go to the next one and go one more, and we're done. Okay, so that was the short, the oh so short version of this talk, and we can open it up for Q&A if people want.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was fascinating. I'm sure a lot of questions. I have a few, but I'm just going to leave it open for people in the room, or if there are people online that would like to send questions, please do so through the chat.
Stop screen sharing, Paula.
I don't know if maybe one question can be related to the slides or something like that. Yeah.
It's making it a little hard for me to see. Yeah. Where is the chat?
There. Chat. Those two shares.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I think we're all good with the chat.
Tom, I had a question about migration.
Yeah, go ahead.
So does the privatization of land and the construction of these fences make it more difficult for migrants to move across the landscape or find a foothold in a new community when they do migrate?
So one thing that I would say is that it's not privatization. I didn't really go into details about this, but I used the term individualization. And the reason that I did that is because according to the rules of the TCOs, according to the Tierras Comunitarias de Origen, the land can't be sold. It can't be privatized. So it remains legally, it remains commons. And so it remains within the community. So if somebody were to leave the community, let's say they just left or they died, that land would then be redistributed to members within the community who would use it for grazing. So that's one thing. So it's not truly privatized. But with the fencing and the individualization, I would say actually what that does is it actually facilitates rotational migration. So what that does is it allows people to leave the community. Keep in mind that where they are located is really close, right up against the Chilean border, and Chile is a much wealthier country than Bolivia. So a lot of people, that's the primary place where people migrate to. People go, down the road, cross the border, and then go into Chile to find work. And many people do this, live most of their lives in Chile, and then return back for ceremonial purposes or to fulfill leadership requirements or something like that within the community. So I would say people belong. So when they live in, people that are members of a community, these are sort of corporate communities. So they're not just residents, they actually belong to the community by lineage. And so they're a member of the IU, and so people would go back to that community. If they were to move somewhere else, it would be much more likely not to move to another community within, say, the IU or within the national park. They would move to a larger city, to La Paz or somewhere in Chile. But I would say that the fencing actually facilitates migration because it allows people to leave their livestock unattended or minimally attended while they're off working.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So I do see one question, Andrea, in the chat. Should we do that one, or do you want to do another one from the room first?
Let's hear Fanny, and then I will take a look at this question for next.
Sounds good.
Okay. I have two questions. First, given the background you gave us about indigeneity, I was wondering, why did you choose indigeneity instead of, for example, other categories that are used there, like originary people?
Yeah.
Or, I'm sure you have heard that many of them don't really like to be called indigenous, or they might self-identify as indigenous.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one question. And the other, the second, I'm not sure if I understood well where is the conflict with the fences and the territorialization? Is it the conflict? Is the conflict being created among these different layers of administrative, let's say, the territories? No, you mentioned the IUs, the marcas, and the TCOs. They are in different layers, and the relations are complex. So, is the fencing causing troubles within or among them, or where is the conflict? That was not very clear for me. Thank you.
So, okay, so I'll take those two in turn. And you're absolutely right about the language of indigenous or indigeneity. In part, that's a practical choice on my part because it's the term that's most common in Anglophone academia. And so if I say indigenous, people have a general idea. If I say originario, probably most people in the room or most people in the English-speaking world are going to have no idea what I'm talking about. But you're absolutely right. So I would say a couple things. Indigeneity is not the same as indigenous identity, nor is it a term that people use as self-identifying. People in the area where I'm working would self-identify as Aymara or as campesino or as campesino originario. right? Originario is a term meaning original inhabitant. This is a term actually that was used by the Spanish and later readopted by native peoples in the Andes, partly to signify their subjectivity as native peoples, and partly to distinguish themselves from lowland peoples, native peoples, who are more typically identified as indigenous, or would call themselves identify as indigenous in Bolivia and elsewhere in the Amazon lowlands. So there is a distinction that people make, which is as much a geographical and historical distinction as anything. So indigeneity, what I'm referring to by using that term, what I'm referring to is a more politicized and self-conscious form of representation. It's the politics of being self-conscious politics of being indigenous, as opposed to the subject, the subjectivity or the subject being of being Aymara or originario or campesino or indigenous. So you're absolutely right that these are contested terms. There's no universally accepted term, and people in the area where I work would not refer to themselves as indigenous. They would refer to themselves more as Aymara or campesino originario. They might refer to people in the Amazon as indigenous. In terms of the conflict, yeah, I don't really make the claim that there are conflicts over fences. What I would say is that that territory is always contested space, meaning that these are spaces which are the establishment of territory is always happens through sort of a contestation over the control of space. And certainly in the establishment of the Sayañas, there were and still are a lot of conflicts, low-level conflicts between neighbors about the use of bofedales, about where animals can and can't graze, and things like that. I think in terms of the larger conflicts, it's more a sense of there are conflicting concepts or tensions that exist between different conceptualizations of territory, and that the individualization of space through the fencing of the Sayañas is in tension with the collective nature of TCOs.
Thank you, Tom. There were a couple of questions in the chat that speak to that as well, and I had one. Is there social differentiation, equity issues, conflict arising around this individualization of parcels? I don't want to put words into the questions that people ask, but I've been trying to group them because we don't have.
Yeah. So one is about the ecological factors, and this is not one that I mentioned, but just really quickly, the ecological factors are of a couple different natures. One is the risk of overgrazing, and people recognize that this is an issue. It's the same with cattle in Colorado, right? If you have they're going to go, particularly in the winter when it's dry, people are going to go, or sorry, in the winter when it's dry, people are going to or the llamas and alpacas are going to congregate around the bofedales because that's where the water is. And so there's, without being actively moved through herding, there is a risk of overgrazing. And people recognize that this happens. The other is that the fences create barriers for the movement of wildlife. So guanacos are a wild camelid that's a cousin of llamas and alpacas. Very similar. They actually look a lot like pronghorn antelope and fill a very, very similar ecological niche. And so just like you can see pronghorns out mixing among cattle out in western Colorado and Wyoming and Utah, you see guanacos and vicuñas, not guanacos, but vicuñas, sorry. Guanacos are another camelid in southern South America, but vicuñas mixing in with the herds of llamas and alpacas. But the fences prevent them from moving. And so there's been that's led to a decrease, about a 75% decrease in the population of vicuñas within the national park. It also prevents the movement of other species as well, suris, which are sort of large ostrich-like flightless birds, and other, things like that. And so there are definitely some ecological impacts with that are very similar to the kinds of ecological impacts you get with fencing in herding systems or ranching systems in North America. Andrea, let me see the other use of the landscape, the fencing. Okay, do you want me to take these in turn, or do you want to group these, Andrea?
Let's, I can, I think we can group the last two ones, right? Because they are related.
Mm-hmm.
Are there competition amongst users?
Yeah.
Or competition that before fencing, and is it turning, do you see a shift from individualization to privatization? Or appropriate?
Well, it wouldn't turn into, there wouldn't be a risk of it turning into privatization because it can't be sold. So it can't be expropriated or sold. The land is communal by nature, by the nature of the TCO, right? So this is legally, it's communal land. In terms of competition with other uses, certainly within the national park, the main other use is tourism. And so one of the complaints that people have, or one of the things that people are concerned about, and this is something I've heard from the park guards and other people that are involved in tourism within the park, is that the fences are unsightly, and so tourists may not want to see them if they enter the park. But there aren't other forms of land use in this area that people engage in that the fencing would come into conflict with. There are in other parts of the Altiplano in Bolivia, and so that might be more of a risk. And in some lower areas, there may be other forms of land use, certainly mining in some areas that are creates a huge problem for bofedales. It's much more of a problem for the bofedales than the bofedales are for mining. But definitely with tourism, I think there's a little bit of a conflict, but in many cases, the people that are involved in tourism are also pastoralists, they're also herders, and so they have their own sayañas, and they have which are fenced. So it's not an open conflict. Isn't not a debate.
Thank you so much, Tom. Do we have?
Can I just put out one little quick comment/question? Thanks very much, Tom. I'm thinking about enclosure and dispossession, and I know you're talking about individualization, not privatization. So it's a little bit, I was just like thinking through those things and thinking about like the intensification of grazing because of the fencing. So keeping animals in like one constrained place, plus like the impacts on bofedales and how that might kind of like affect their long run ability to like serve as a food source for llamas or alpacas. And then thinking a little bit about your work on dispossession by accumulation, which is very different, but like thinking about like how, with the water pollution and so thinking about like the long run potential of slow ecological change, but also exacerbated by the intensification, and how like these kinds of individualization through enclosure might lead to different forms of like almost like self-dispossession from the ability to continue with that livelihood practice. I don't know if that makes any sense or if that's at all.
It's an interesting, I think it's one of the things that makes this an interesting case is that these are processes in which families are choosing, or communities as communities are choosing to do this, right? And in fact, they are going against the park rules, which say that there should be no fences, and they're also going against the internal rules of the TCO, which says all land should be communal, right? And communally managed. And so they're making decisions based on essentially economic reasons. The materials were made available by NGOs and by projects, but the projects were actually intended to build corrals and other kinds of things to facilitate grazing, but they weren't intended to demarcate the sayanyas, to create these boundaries. And people took the materials made available by these projects and said, we're just going to demarcate the boundary because I'm sick of my neighbors, alpacas getting onto my land. And so you have, I mean, if anything, there's this kind of process of kind of a commercial entrepreneurial sort of subjectivity, which is emerging, right? And these are people who are very, very engaged in the capitalist economy. And in some cases, probably more interested in just doing their own thing and in getting ahead and making money than they are in following these kind of communal kind of practices. And so what I would say is there is this kind of tension then between what is set up as these collective forms of land management through the TCOs and through the IU, which respond to a certain sort of tendency or a certain form of identity among indigenous peoples in the Andes. And at the same time, there's this sort of compulsion. There's this material need to engage in the market economy, which runs counter to this. And so I think what you find is that the Sayanya sort of embodies in a lot of ways these two sort of tendencies, which are in not open conflict, I wouldn't say, but these two tendencies that are definitely in tension, if that makes sense. Whether it's expropriation, whether it becomes appropriation, whether you're dispossessing others, I don't know. The people I think there would be a question. Part of this I don't know the answer to that, but there may be, I think one of the next steps for me is to go and spend more time in the communities, finding out, are there people who are left behind? Are there people whose access to resources were excluded? That definitely is the case with water in some communities, that the hardening of these boundaries in these areas meant that some families, depending on where they're located in elevation, geographically relative to the Bofedales, are left without water or without good access to water. So some, depending on where you're located, where your Sayanya is located, you have better or worse access to water. And so that's one source of low-level conflict. It's not an open conflict because the main grazing areas were already established. It's just that they became sort of hardened in space, and the commons area were reduced through the fencing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tom. And well, given it's 1 p.m., people are starting to trickle out because they have to get to classes and meetings. So I don't think we have time for more questions. I do have many, and maybe I'll send you an email. But thank you so much. That was fascinating work and very inspiring. Very interesting dynamics and tensions and changes, and you can see all the layers of the complexity, the climate change, the land use change, the political, the market, migration. So thank you. Thank you so much for being willing to share your work and engaging conversation with us. And hopefully we'll see you in this space again. So let's give a round of applause to Tom again. Thank you so much, Tom. You're to leave if you need to.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody. All right, have a good afternoon.
Thank
you.
Tom.
Me parece interesante porque es algo que también he notado que tengan